This video is brought to you by the TLDR store. Support your favourite country, including the world, China and Australia, by picking up a Countries with Shoes pin badge. And get a free random badge when you buy any two and use code AussieChina. The link is down below. So, over the last decade or so, China and Australia have really fallen out. Back in 2014, after years of close economic relations, China and Australia looked like besties. They'd signed a free trade agreement. Australia was planning to teach Mandarin in schools. Xi Jinping actually went to Australia's parliament to praise their innovation and global influence. But today, though, things are a little different. China is waging an unofficial trade war against Australia, and Australia has just started buying up nuclear-powered submarines to fend off China. So in this video, we're going to explain how this has happened, and what it tells us about global politics more generally. So, where does this story start? Well, it probably begins in the mid-2000s, when a trade deal between the two countries really started to accelerate. And during this period, Australia started importing more stuff from China, and that was for the same reason that every other country's Chinese imports increased. China was mass manufacturing cheap goods, and that's exactly what the West wanted. What was unique about Australia's relationship to China, though, was that unlike many other Western countries, which ran huge trade deficits with China, Australia actually exported more stuff to China than it imported. Essentially, most other developed countries bought a lot of stuff from China, but didn't really sell them much. Australia, on the other hand, actually sold China more stuff than it bought. So, what kind of thing was Australia selling? Well, the main exports were iron ore, gas, and coal. As a manufacturing behemoth, China needed commodities and energy. Australia, chock-a-block full of natural resources and relatively nearby, was more than happy to provide. So, over time, Australia became more and more dependent on China for its exports. And in 2018, China overtook Japan as Australia's largest export market. By 2020, China accounted for a massive 42% of all Australian exports. For context, second-place Japan accounted for only 13%. And as this trade relationship deepened, so did the political one. In the early 2000s, Australia was squarely on the side of the US. In 2003, George Bush actually described the land down under as America's deputy. By the late 2000s, though, things weren't so black and white. Under pressure from China, then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, the first Australian Prime Minister to fluently speak Mandarin, unilaterally pulled out of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. More commonly known as the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue is a strategic coalition between India, Japan, the US and Australia that's basically an American counterbalance to Chinese power in the Indo-Pacific. Australia's decision to leave the Quad represented a high point for China-Australia relations, and a real success on China's behalf. They'd successfully transformed China's economic weight into political weight. And former Prime Ministers Paul Keating and the late Malcolm Fraser actually recommended that Australia withdrew from its US alliance altogether. And from this point, it was smooth sailing for the next 5 years or so, culminating in the 2014 Free Trade Agreement between the two countries, and a visit from Xi Jinping to the Australian Parliament, where he praised Australia's innovation and global influence. Then, all of a sudden, things went downhill very fast. Now, there are various proximate causes for this decline. Australia didn't agree with China's territorial claims in the South China Sea, for example. And in 2017, there was a scandal involving Chinese investment in Australian political parties. But the big change, the one that made the major difference, was wolf warrior diplomacy. For those of you who don't know, wolf warrior diplomacy is a term used to describe the CCP's increasingly aggressive diplomatic style. Chinese diplomats began employing wolf warrior diplomacy in 2016, which is, not coincidentally, when Sino-Australian relations began to deteriorate. For example, in July 2016, after an international tribunal ruled against China's territorial claims in the South China Sea, Australia issued a joint statement with Japan and the US, calling on China to abide by its rulings. Now, before the days of wolf warrior diplomacy, the CCP might have made some token effort to abide by the ruling, or possibly just have ignored this kind of statement. However, the CCP's Wolf Warriors of 2016 took a slightly different tone. State media warned Australia to, quote, behave, and described Australia as a paper cat, a downgrade on paper tiger. A few days later, the state-run Global Times went one further, apparently threatening to strike Australian vessels if they interfered in the South China Sea. Later in the year, incensed by allegations of doping against a Chinese swimmer, the Chinese state media went one further, describing Australia as Britain's offshore prison on the fringes of civilization. Then, in 2017, after an investigation by Four Corners, an Australian current affairs program found that Chinese donors were attempting to influence Australian politicians, then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull ordered an inquiry. In response, the Chinese Foreign Ministry called the investigation totally pointless, and later accused Australian politicians of blatantly irrational behaviours. You get the point. From 2016 onwards, Chinese wolf warriors raged at any perceived slight. And things really came to a head in 2020, when Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison called for an international investigation into the world's handling of the coronavirus and its origins, which the CCP apparently interpreted as an implicit endorsement of the lab leak theory. China's embassy in Australia complained that Australian politicians are keen to parrot what those Americans have asserted and simply follow them in staging political attacks on China. The Foreign Ministry then went further, saying that Australia was highly irresponsible to resort to politically motivated suspicion and accusation, and advising them to put aside ideological bias and political games. And China's deputy head of mission in Canberra said that the, quote, shocking news of Australia's call for an investigation hurts the feelings of the Chinese people, because Australia is supposed to be a good friend of China. And when Morrison refused to take back his comments, China retaliated with an unofficial embargo on Australian coal exports. Although, in retrospect, this probably wasn't the best idea. Unsurprisingly, all of this hyper-aggressive rhetoric doesn't play particularly well with either Australian politicians or the Australian public. Australian politicians know that being seen to be bullied by China isn't good for their chances of re-election. And the Australian public doesn't like how, rude the CCP is being about their country. And the stats bear this out. In 2020, 81% of Australians had an unfavourable view of China, compared to just 15% with a favourable view. Back in 2017, just 32% of Australians had an unfavourable view of China, while 64% had a favourable view. This means that in the space of 3 years, China's approval rating in the eyes of the Australian public has fallen from a positive 32% to negative 66%. For context, that's like them going from Arnold Schwarzenegger to levels lower than Katie Hopkins. Unsurprisingly, a majority of Australians now also think that Australia should prioritise ties with the US over China, a complete U-turn of back in 2015 when the reverse was true. Australians are also more likely than ever to view China's military advances as bad news for their country, which is presumably one of the reasons why Morrison signed up to AUKUS. With those who see China's military build-up as a bad thing up 7 points from 2013 to 2017, and those who see China as a threat up by 12 points. You get the point. China has gone from Australia's best mate to, not quite a military enemy, but at least a strategic rival. So what does this tell us? Well, it's proof that at least sometimes China's economic power isn't always politically decisive. It's also proof that wolf warrior diplomacy is, not very good diplomacy. And that's probably because it's mostly intended for China's domestic audience. But it's still nonetheless true that it doesn't play very well with international audiences. But what do you think? Do you think that China or Australia were right in this dispute? Or do both sides just need to make friends? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. As I said at the start of this video, for a limited time, if you order any 2 Countries with Shoes pin badges, then you'll get a 3rd pin absolutely free. It's as easy as that. Buy 2 and get a 3rd random pin free. And if you don't like the random pin we send you, then just give it someone as a Christmas gift. Stick it on someone's backpack without telling them. Attach it to the sole of your shoe to give yourself an extra tap. It's up to you, but the store is linked below, and the code is Aussie China. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. And a special thank you to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you too want to see your name at the end of videos, then you can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description.